If you think Roman banquets were all silk togas and fancy wine goblets, think again. Of course, the elite dined like royalty, but beneath the gold plates and glittering halls were rotting meat and vomit buckets that would make Gordon Ramsay call the health inspector. I'll admit, when I first read about Roman banquets, I pictured something out of a movie with people lounging like they were in a fancy hotel lobby. Turns out these banquets were less dinner parties and more social battlegrounds. For the Roman elite, feasts weren't just about eating, they were about power. Every banquet was a flex, a chance for wealthy Romans to show off their influence like a guy revving his engine at a stoplight. The food, the wine, the decorations, everything had to scream, "I am richer than you." But let's talk about the room itself, because Roman dining setups were a disaster waiting to happen. Banquets were held in special dining rooms called triclinia. Sounds fancy, right? Well, here is the catch. Instead of sitting at tables like normal people, guests lounged on couches, propped up awkwardly on their left elbows while reaching for food with their right hand. This was just like you're trying to eat spaghetti while half lying down, elbow jammed into your side. Yeah, now imagine doing that for hours. It gets worse. These banquet rooms usually had marble floors, which looked impressive, yep, but they basically turned the place into an ice rink once guests started spilling wine and sauces everywhere. One wrong step and you were performing the ancient Roman version of Wipeout. And let's not forget the lighting. Roman banquets were mostly lit by flickering oil lamps, dim, smoky, and barely bright enough to see what you were eating. Spoiled meat, moldy bread, mystery sauce that looked like it belonged in a potion shop. Yeah, you probably wouldn't notice until you woke up regretting every decision from the night before. Okay, there were 3 types of ancient Roman banquets for different gatherings. The first type was the public feasts, or epulum. Public feasts were massive, like Thanksgiving kind of a dinner, but the entire town showed up and nobody brought napkins. These were mostly held outdoors to celebrate victories, holidays, or the arrival of some big-shot Roman senator who wanted to impress the locals. And trust me, impress didn't mean fine dining, it meant excess, whole roasted animals, overflowing wine jugs, and crowds packed tighter than a mosh pit at a rock concert. Are you worried about hygiene? Yeah, that took a back seat. People tossed bones, bread crusts, and greasy scraps right onto the floor like toddlers who never learned table manners. Some guests didn't even bother to move after they finished eating. They would just roll over on the grass, stuffed to the brim like bloated sea lions. It wasn't so much a banquet as it was a chaotic feeding frenzy, less Michelin star and more middle school cafeteria on pizza day. Next were the private dinner parties, or cena. Now, this is where things got weird. These weren't just casual gatherings. They were social battlegrounds where hosts fought to outdo each other with over-the-top stunts. Imagine hosting a dinner party, but instead of serving pasta, you are presented a roasted pig, and suddenly live birds explode out of it, like some bizarre meat-based piñata. Yeah, that actually happened. And forget about casual conversations. These parties were like ancient TED Talks. Rich Romans would sit there flexing their wealth, bragging about their imported spices or rare birds they had shipped in from halfway across the empire. Some would even pass around gold-plated plates just to remind you they were richer than you. Basically, if Instagram influencers existed in ancient Rome, this would be their vibe. And lastly, there were drinking parties, also known as commissatio. Now, if you thought public feasts were messy, this was a whole new level. Commissatio were basically Roman frat parties, but without the red solo cups. These gatherings weren't about the food, they were about getting absolutely plastered. Wine flowed like water, and not the fancy kind either. Romans usually mixed their wine with seawater to keep it preserved, which sounds more like a survival tactic. And if you were hoping for some calm after-dinner conversation, forget it. These parties ended with blackout drunk guests stumbling over furniture and breaking cups on themselves like they were auditioning for Rome's Got Talent Disaster Edition. Now, what they were actually eating was a stomachache waiting to happen. These guys treated food like it was part of a circus act. See, without refrigerators, Romans had a bit of a spoilage problem. Meats, fish, and produce didn't exactly stay fresh after being dragged across the empire in wooden carts under the Mediterranean sun. So what they did was they got creative. And by creative, I mean they drowned everything in enough herbs, spices, and sauces to knock out a grown man's sinuses. If a hunk of meat started turning green, no problem. Just bury it in cumin, mint, or honey until no one noticed. Say your buddy is serving you a steak that is one bad sniff away from summoning flies, but instead of tossing it, he just douses it in cinnamon and says, "Trust me, bro, it's spiced." Then there was their signature sauce called garum. It was the ketchup of the Roman world, and they put it on everything. But the recipe? Oh man. Garum was made by taking fish guts, yes, the slimy, stinky leftovers, and letting them sit in the sun for weeks, sometimes months. The result came out as a thick, salty sludge that smelled like someone's month-old laundry basket, and Romans loved it. They dumped it on meat, bread, vegetables, probably their breakfast cereal too, honestly. I read one description that said garum smelled like rotten eggs and old socks in a heat wave, and at that point I figured I would just stick to olive oil. But Romans didn't stop at spoiled meat and fermented fish juice at the banquets. Oh no, they took it up a notch. They ate peacock brains. They snacked on ostrich tongues, and if that wasn't impressive enough, they raised conger eels on a diet of Christian slaves. Yeah, I repeat, Christian slaves. Some elite Romans believed feeding human flesh to their prized eels gave the meat a richer flavor, because nothing says fine dining like a fish that has basically been hitting the Roman version of Whole Foods for premium protein. And don't get me started on their delicacies. Have you ever tried roast parrots? How about stuffed dormice? Yep, they would fatten those little guys up in clay pots, then roast them whole, and sprinkle them with honey and poppy seeds. It's like they took fancy appetizers and said, "Let's make this weird." Some hosts were so obsessed with surprising their guests that they didn't even care if the food tasted good. One chef famously served an entire fish that looked fresh until you cut it open and realized it was stuffed with cow liver. I don't know what's worse, being tricked by a fish or realizing your dinner is just an elaborate prank. Oh, and the seafood was its own nightmare. Fresh oysters and shellfish were highly prized, but the whole fresh part was debatable. Transporting seafood across the empire turned it into a rotting mess. Guests would sit down expecting luxury, but end up gagging on spoiled clams that smelled like low tide in a garbage dump. Now, when it came to drinks, the Romans had some interesting ideas about what counted as fine wine. Forget sipping a smooth Cabernet. Roman wine was more like a science experiment gone wrong. For Romans, drinking wine straight was seen as barbaric. It was something only the uncultured did, so instead they watered it down. And I don't mean just a splash. Some mixes were so weak that you would probably get more flavor licking a damp sponge. But it gets worse. To make their wine last longer, Romans started adding seawater to the drinks too. Apparently, someone took one sip and thought that it needed more ocean. The salt helped preserve the wine during long journeys, but the end result was like sipping red wine that tasted like someone stirred it with a sweaty sock. And if that wasn't nasty enough, they sometimes added tar. Yep, actual tar. The idea was that it kept the wine from spoiling, but in reality, it just made every glass taste like someone dared you to drink asphalt. Now let's talk about hygiene, or lack of it. By now, you must have had an idea how disgustingly unhygienic ancient Roman banquets were, right? Well, they weren't big on cleaning their wine cups between refills. Instead, they would just pass the same cup around like it was a party favor. Suppose one guy sneezed into his drink, and now you are sipping on his flu like it's part of the vintage. Honestly, those cups probably had more bacteria than a public restroom door handle. It's a miracle anyone survived these banquets at all. And because Romans never knew when to quit, they turned drinking into a sport. These contests were more about seeing who would collapse first. Guests would down cup after cup until someone passed out, vomited, or if they were really committed, did both. I read one account where a guest got so drunk he mistook a decorative statue for his date and tried flirting with it, which honestly is still more charming than some of the awkward dinner dates I've witnessed. You've probably heard the whole Romans had special puke rooms called vomitoriums myth. Yeah, that's not quite true. Vomitoriums were just the exits in Roman theaters, designed to spew crowds out like a stadium funnel. But what was true? The Romans loved a good tactical chunder. When I first read that some Romans intentionally vomited mid-banquet just to make room for more food, I thought there is no way. But nope, they actually did it. Not everyone, mind you, but for those committed to competitive gluttony, it was practically part of the game plan. The method was simple. Grab a feather, yes, a feather, tickle the back of your throat, and boom, you are back in the game with everything out. It was like I need to clear some space for the next round of peacock brains. Basically a human reboot button. And if you are wondering who had the delightful job of cleaning up this madness, well, that is where the slaves came in. These poor souls were tasked with mopping up puddles of vomit, spilled wine, and half-chewed oyster shells, all while guests carried on like nothing happened. Suppose being a Roman slave and realizing your night schedule included both dodging projectile puke and scrubbing marble floors with what was probably the ancient equivalent of a rag on a stick. Rough gig. But hey, at least there was one upside. For guests, vomiting mid-banquet wasn't just accepted, it was practically encouraged. Now, if you think that was bad, Roman table manners weren't exactly winning any awards either. For starters, spitting was basically a dining room staple. Finished gnawing on a bone, no worries, just spit it right onto the floor. Chewed an olive pit, straight to the tiles. Even wealthy hosts didn't mind that because they had a sneaky trick to make the mess look intentional. They would decorate their floors with mosaics designed to look like scattered food scraps, so when guests inevitably turned the place into a landfill, it blended right in. But the real king of nasty habits was Emperor Claudius. The man actually encouraged farting at the banquet table because he believed trapped gas could be dangerous. That is right. The Roman elite were basically hosting Michelin-starred meals where spitting bones and ripping a loud one wasn't just excused, it was practically good manners. Honestly, I would love to see Gordon Ramsay walk into one of those feasts. If you thought being a guest at a Roman banquet sounded rough, imagine being one of the poor souls stuck working at one. Roman banquet slaves were human mops, spending the entire night scrubbing vomit, urine, and half-eaten pigeon wings off the floor, all while dodging blackout-drunk nobles who probably couldn't tell the difference between a cup of wine and a chamber pot. And if you were a banquet slave, mistakes were never forgiven. In fact, they came at a serious cost. Spilling wine on an important guest could land you in serious trouble. You just broke a goblet while you asked for a punishment. Even falling behind on cleaning could mean facing your master's anger, and they weren't exactly known for patience. But the worst part was that some slaves were forced to eat the very dishes their masters rejected, and I'm not talking about leftovers. If the emperor didn't like the sauce, guess what? You are eating the sauce. Emperor Elagabalus was a pro psychopath. The man actually made his cooks survive entirely on the sauces they prepared, meaning if they accidentally whipped up a dodgy fish gravy, tough luck. That is dinner. I mean, I've had bosses who gave harsh feedback, but die by your own seasoning feels a little extreme. Romans didn't just make banquets messy, they turned them into full-on weird acts. And no one loved chaos quite like Emperor Elagabalus. This guy treated his dinners like deranged social experiments. Once, Elagabalus filled an entire room, floor to ceiling, with flower petals, which sounds beautiful, right? Except his guests nearly suffocated because they couldn't breathe under the mountain of blossoms. Imagine dying at a party because your lungs got clogged with daisies. But that was tame compared to some of his other stunts. Elagabalus had a habit of drugging his guests by casually slipping them something during dinner and then dumping them into pitch-black rooms with lions or leopards just to watch them freak out. And if you did survive one of Elagabalus's banquets, well, congratulations. Your reward might be a basket of dead flies. Yeah, this guy actually handed out flies as post-dinner gifts. Meanwhile, some guests received live animals, just handed a goat like it was a party favor. I can't help but wonder what these poor souls were thinking, walking home with a half-conscious friend in one hand and a live chicken in the other. If there's one thing the Romans excelled at besides conquering half the known world, it was wasting food. Their banquets were extravagant displays of wealth where too much wasn't nearly enough. Some hosts went so far as to sprinkle actual gold dust on their food because apparently nothing tells that you are richer than everyone else like turning your dinner into expensive glitter. Others melted entire pearls into their wine, not for flavor, mind you, just to flex on their guests. And if the food is dropped on the floor, forget the 5-second rule. Romans believed anything that hit the floor now belonged to the dead. No one touched it, which meant banquets ended with floors that looked like someone flipped a buffet table upside down. Bones, bread crusts, and half-chewed fish guts, all left to rot until the slaves cleaned up, or until the smell became unbearable, whichever came first. But no one had this gluttonous madness better than Apicius, Rome's most legendary foodie. This man spent his entire fortune chasing the perfect feast, to the point where when he had only 10 million sesterces left, still enough to retire in luxury, he panicked, decided he was broke, and poisoned himself because he thought living on that tiny fortune was beneath him. Imagine going broke because you insisted on serving flamingo tongues and peacock brains at every dinner. But even Apicius's bizarre food obsession couldn't match Emperor Domitian's twisted taste for dinner party theatrics. At one infamous feast, Domitian invited his guests to what historians now call the Black Banquet. Sounds edgy already, right? Well, it gets worse. When the guests arrived, they were led into a pitch-black dining room. No candles, no torches, just darkness. The tables were lined with black marble, the food was dyed black, and at each seat was a tombstone engraved with the guest's own name. Let's say you show up to a dinner party and realize the theme is your funeral. Guests reportedly sat in terrified silence the entire evening, too afraid to eat or even speak. They believed the banquet wasn't just a prank. They thought Domitian was about to have them all killed. In fairness, this was ancient Rome. It wasn't exactly out of character for an emperor to poison his guests just because. Turns out the whole thing was an elaborate scare tactic. No one actually died, unless you count the emotional trauma. When the chaos finally ended, the real victims, once again, were the banquet slaves. They walked into that room afterward, filled with vomit-stained couches, wine-soaked floors, and piles of rotting food, all of it marinating together in the warm Roman air. Slaves had to scrub every inch of the place until the mess no longer smelled like someone microwaved a fish market. And since Romans weren't exactly big on leaving the table, some guests didn't even bother finding a bathroom. Instead, slaves brought urine pots directly to their couches. Yep, some people sat right there, ate a chicken leg, downed some wine, and then casually relieved themselves. And guess who had to carry that pot away? Yeah, exactly. At this point, I'm convinced Roman banquet slaves were trauma survivors. Honestly, if I were a Roman slave and someone told me, "Hey, you are working a banquet tonight," I would be faking my own death. Now, before you dismiss all this as ancient nonsense, let me remind you some of that Roman chaos still lingers today. Over-the-top wedding feasts blame the Romans. That one guy at the bar who thinks taking 12 shots in a row is impressive, yep, Romans again. And let's not forget competitive eating contests, because nothing screams ancient Roman energy like watching someone inhale 30 hot dogs in 10 minutes. Rome may have fallen, but its love for excessive messy dining, yeah, that survived just fine. So the next time you are at a banquet dinner party and someone spills wine on the table, just be glad they're not reaching for a feather. Because honestly, compared to Roman banquets, your worst dining experience is practically fine dining. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more bizarre history, and let me know in the comments, what is the weirdest dinner party story you have ever heard? Trust me, no one is topping Elagabalus's dead fly giveaway, but hey, surprise me.